Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here as the inaugural presenter for. I'm just going to sit down on the table if you don't mind. I can't walk around anymore today. And I'd like to keep this fairly informal and encourage you to make comments or ask questions as I go along if some things are not clear. The notion, the fact that we have an organization on this campus that's focused on advocacy for men and boys reminded me of a kind of quietly seminal moment that I had in the very early years of the 2000s at a conference in Geneva, a gender and development conference, where I was presenting some of the same themes and perspectives in a different context that I'll be presenting today. And I had given my presentation, and always a little bit timorous because, of course, if you're going to a gender and development conference, that usually means a feminism and development conference or a women in development conference. I mean, the terms are more or less interchangeable as these disciplines have evolved, at least until very recently. And so one always felt in danger of being a bit of a skunk at the garden party when one went along and spoke about men and boys in this context. I'll talk maybe a little later about, somewhat to my surprise then and since, the sources of support and personal kind of validation that I felt in this inquiry have sometimes come from surprising avenues. But I won't forget this African woman delegate at the conference. After I'd finished my talk and we were breaking for coffee and I was gathering together my papers, and she strolled behind me and patted me on the shoulder in a kind of fraternal way and said, "Good for you. Men need advocates." And it just stunned me briefly, momentarily. Maybe it was the first time I'd ever heard it put that straightforwardly. It was revealing to me that it came from a woman who was from a traditionally kind of subaltern part of the world, and yet had clearly a kind of empathy for what men and boys also were experiencing, and that's a trend that I've encountered. And I want, among other things today, to make a couple of moves, one of them kind of symbolized by that encounter with the African woman in Geneva, and globalize this discussion a little. Because I think one of the big problems with gender discourse, gender critique in North America, until relatively recently for feminism, and still for the much more nascent kind of discourse of men and boys, their vulnerabilities, their rights, etc. This has been a very, very global North-centric critique. And most of what we understand as issues for men and boys tend to be the particular issues, be they life expectancy, occupational fatalities, suicides, substance abuse, vulnerability to murder, whatever, that are derived from the experience of North Americans overall, and to some extent UK and Australia have perhaps been the two other nodes of literature on men and boys. And I think, as with feminist critiques and discourses, and I'll maybe explain in closing why I still call myself and consider myself a feminist, but one of the reasons that I do is because I think that there's quite a lot of honorable feminists over the last 20 or 30 years around the world who have really worked to globalize that gender discourse, the process of what we call worlding women, to cite the title of a well-known book. And we're at the earliest stage of that with men. What we understand about men and boys is almost overwhelmingly derived from a kind of sociological critique of developed modern societies. And if one of my arguments for you tonight is going to be that the discourse we use and the frameworks we establish tend very often to highlight the experiences of some and to exclude the experiences of others, then I think that also needs to be fitted into a global north versus global south understanding, and recognize how often we frame these issues in a way that rules out the large majority of people on the planet. And I have been doing my damnedest over the course of the last 30 or 40 years to become a citizen of the world. I'm at 99 countries and counting in terms of my global travels. It's great being a university professor with those long summers. And a lot of what I've seen and observed that makes me empathetic, for example, towards many feminist causes, is derived from my observation of societies around the world where the situation of women and girls is often parlous and oppressed in a way that we can really barely only guess at. And I think much the same can be said for men and boys as well. And one of the books that I'm most proud of, and that if you'd like to kind of get a sense of what a worlding men type of project would look like, I have an edited collection called Men of the Global South. And it addresses a lot of common experiential, existential, and violence-related issues for men and boys around the world. It was published by Zed Books. But for better or worse, I don't think there's anything like it. And it was a challenge to actually say, okay, what can we say that's meaningful about men and masculinities in this huge variety of countries and cultures around the world? And I think there are things that we can say. And with regard to the proximate topic of missing and murdered Aboriginals in Canada, I think there's also important connections that we can draw between the Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, First Nations, I'm going to use all of those words more or less interchangeably. Many observers have long recognized that Indigenous populations in settler colonial societies constitute a kind of third world within the first world, or a global south within the global north. They were even called the fourth world for a while. Back when we had three worlds, the fourth world was the Indigenous world. And it was a reflection of the fact that many of the experiences of Indigenous peoples worldwide in developed countries have much more in common in terms of physical debility or physical impact and victimization, and the whole range of kind of destructive effects that is paralleled by men and boys in other parts of the world and by women and girls in other parts of the world. And not only can we see those parallels in experience, but I think we can also see parallels in the discourse with which these issues are approached, what we notice and what we don't notice. And the failure and apparent inability, even among Aboriginal women and girls, to recognize that there is an issue of victimization of Indigenous peoples in this country beyond only Aboriginal women and girls. This is, I think, a remarkable testament in a lot of ways to how partial and biased in many ways the discourse has been, how destructive I think it's been in terms of directing resources away from vulnerable populations, and how we really need to make a lot of previously kind of unthinkable issues and unframed and undiscussed issues more thinkable, and discuss them more widely, perhaps particularly in contexts like this on university campuses, the bright minds of the future and so on. So my own engagement with these issues really began on December 6th, 1989, with events that I'm sure resonate with most of you in this room at the École Polytechnique. And I was living in Montreal at the time, down the road from where the massacre took place of those 14 young women. And I remember being as shocked and traumatized as everyone else in Montreal. I was one of the hundreds of thousands that filed past the caskets of the victims of the Montreal massacre. And it really shook me on some level that I didn't quite understand. And as I started to process that, it certainly made me more keenly aware of the vulnerabilities of women to certain forms of male violence. But one of the things that struck me was how, and Theron and I were talking about this before I started tonight, was how unusual that was in the history of male violence against women. Not that a man would kill women or would kill many women, but that he would separate women from men and then kill the women. And even at that very early stage, just on the basis of maybe an imbibed cultural knowledge, I thought, well, hang on a sec, when that kind of selection happens, gender, according to gender, who is it usually getting killed? It's men, overwhelmingly. The classic case in modern times is, of course, the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia in 1995, 7,000 to 8,000 men and boys separated out from the wider population and exterminated. You can go all the way back to the Old Testament and the Homer and Thucydides and find references to this and examples of this. And yet, it struck me that, first of all, that École Polytechnique was being presented as somehow representative of violence against women, read male violence against women, which it really wasn't. It was a unique and highly unusual event. And to what extent was it really representative of patterns of violence and gendered violence more generally? And this is what sort of started me off on the investigation that led to my becoming a scholar of comparative genocide studies and to working around the concept, which is not my own concept, of gendercide, gender selective mass killing in a kind of genocidal context. And as I explored that over the course of the decade of the 1990s, I began to realize just that there was nothing on this subject. And that was really, it still strikes me as amazing that when I published my article, Gendercide and Genocide, in a comparative genocide journal in the year 2000, I believe that was the first piece of writing in human history that had ever adopted a comparative and global historical approach to that phenomenon of the selective targeting of particularly younger men of a perceived fighting age for extermination. And yet, as I say, it's in the Old Testament, it's in Thucydides. How come nobody had ever even written an article on this subject? And what were not only for the sort of empirical historical dimension, but what were the moral and ethical and humanitarian implications of this? No one had asked that question either. If they noticed it, it was like, okay, the naturalized male victim is being killed in war. That's not a story. It doesn't stand out. It's a stereotypical picture. What does stand out is the unexpected or less expected or less traditional victim, the culturally constructed to be more empathy generating victim, the more kind of stereotypically vulnerable victim. And the mass, in many genocides, as I've discovered around the world, the strictly killing dimension is very often bounded 85 or 90% by the killing of mostly younger men. Not just in Bosnia, Bangladesh in 1971, East Timor. I mean, there's many, many other examples, many African cases also. And yet, what I was seeing when I looked at the literature on violence and international relations, gender and war, gender and conflict, was an equivalent or a kind of paralleling collapsing of gender into women, or sometimes women and children, which is all one word, incidentally, and I'm going to get back to that. And gender clearly, whatever you think of men as potential victims of gendered violence, you can't surely, even as, you know, the most orthodox feminists, deny that men are just as gendered as women. I mean, that's logical. You could say they're gendered to be misogynist monsters, if you like, but they are clearly gendered. And yet the entire discourse of gender had basically become a synonym for women. And how much was left out of the picture of gender-based violence, GBV as we call it, if the entire definition of gender from the start is limited to a narrower range of categories and consciously excludes half the human race. That's problematic, but it had not been problematized, I think. And to the extent that there was a men's movement underway, as I said, it tended to be very much a global north-focused one, and therefore not particularly interested in issues of genocide and crimes against humanity and war necessarily, because these were not societies where those featured. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is a critique that has been interested in filling in some of the details empirically in these gaps in our understanding that we think we know, we think we have that knowledge, and when we push and we probe, we really don't. We often don't have the most basic data. And this is one of the most serious issues with the consideration of missing and murdered Aboriginal men and boys right now, is that it's very hard to get the data, particularly on things like the missing, which I'll talk about shortly, and even a gender breakdown for men of how many murder cases of Aboriginal men and boys are solved versus unsolved. So we have those figures for women, the RCMP has released them, we don't have them for men. So part of it is a kind of needle in a haystack hunt. From an intellectual perspective, it's actually quite exciting, because you have to dig through tens of thousands of pages of human rights reports, media coverage, general histories, gender works, to find the nuggets that serve your devious purposes. And gradually you can assemble enough of them that you can have enough to sustain an argument over 20 or 30 pages and back it with the necessary resources. But it's a really fragmentary quest, and it's a frustrating one often when you run up against this empirical barrier that just nobody has been interested in these issues before, and so there is no real information, certainly not comparative or global information on them. I don't think I'll mention them again. But as somebody who works in the United Nations system also, I do work with the Office of the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide in New York. And or international governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations like the UN, like the key human rights NGOs, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, like the gender and X ministries that are created in many national governments these days. These are, to my mind, some of the key players, the most important players, and some of the leading culprits, if you like. Because, and in the collection Gender Inclusive, for example, I have done a very systematic analysis of Amnesty International's gender coverage during the Kosovo War in 1999, which I followed microscopically as it was unfolding. And showed precisely how their entire mindset of gendered vulnerability was around women and girls, you know, and even when there are entire villages with no men, you know, if you find it, it's only by find that out, it's only by reading between the lines, or because one of the village women mentions it and they feel obliged to leave it in. And so the reason I want to stress that is because, as someone who works in the intellectual sphere, it's quite striking to me how quickly mindsets and perspectives and frameworks can change. And in my own personal experience, that's reflected in the fact that I've gone from being the skunk at the garden party at a lot of these conferences to being curiously quite in demand right now, very often as the token male in a gender and X collection. And they're like, God, it's all women. And we really should have something to say about men and boys. So let's call Jones, really the only guy who's done anything on this, And so I tend to get a lot of repetitive invitations, which I'm now saying no to because I can only repeat myself so many times. But for me, that's an important sign of progress. And whenever I'm invited to what I think is a token male appearance, I'll generally accept it, and accept it without being a prima donna about it or criticizing people for not inviting more men, because it's a start. And because I think particularly in feminist academics around issues like development, gender and violence, as more and more women from the global south have gotten involved, a lot of their concerns to have men involved in the discussion as well has started to erode some of the prejudices of northern/western feminists, I think. And it's become recognized that you can't really talk about gender without talking about men and boys as well, whatever you want to say about it. But that can happen very quickly. I mean, in the space of my own academic career, 12 or 15 years, institutional change happens at a glacial pace by comparison. And what I am seeing in the UN system, what I'm seeing in these national government agencies and ministries, including Canadians, what I'm seeing in the human rights NGOs with some notable and encouraging exceptions, is much the same kind of ossified mindset and equation of gender with women or gender with women and girls, and gender-based violence with not only violence against women and girls, but male violence against women and girls, which means things like the plight of domestic workers at female hands, or women as mother-in-laws in abusive relationships domestically, for example, in countries like India and so on, tend to be left off their agenda, their gender agenda. All of this is by way, I think, of situating this issue of Aboriginal men and boys in the broader context of what has become a real cause célèbre in activist politics in Canada over the last several years, and that is the call for an inquiry into murdered and missing Aboriginal women. Again, to incorporate the global perspective, when this campaign first started being launched, I, having worked in Mexico for a number of years not long previously, immediately thought of the cause célèbre in Mexico and around the world over the murdered and missing women of Ciudad Juarez. How many of you are familiar with that case in northern Mexico? The so-called femicide with well over 150 at the time I did the research over the previous decade, women who had been murdered, often with sexual attacks, often with mutilation, often their bodies buried in the desert, and so on. And this became a real global cause and was used to generate outrage around the issue of femicide. I was living in Mexico at the time, and I picked up the phone and got onto the government ministries and got some data. And I started looking into the patterns of violence in Ciudad Juarez, and found a very useful article, obscure article by a journalist named Debbie Nathan, another interestingly kind of solidaristic female commentator on these issues, who had also done some digging and had discovered that homicide victims in Ciudad Juarez at the time of the peak of this controversy were somewhere between 87 and 90% male. Okay? Now, when that statistic is mentioned, at least to those who are familiar with Ciudad Juarez and the drug wars in Mexico and so on, I wonder how many people's minds automatically think, well, yeah, there's more men being killed than women, but it's a drug war. They're gang members. they're petty drug operatives and they're getting bumped off. It's a culture of violence among men. It's not the same thing as women being targeted misogynistically because they're women. Well, you dig a little further. Is that true? According to the categorizations, only 20% of the male homicides in Ciudad Juarez were classified as drug-related. And a fairly substantial proportion of the women's homicides as well were classified as drug-related, which is often not brought up. And again, we confront the very same pattern that we're seeing around murdered and missing Aboriginals in Canada. A campaign arises that wants to draw attention to this issue. Great, says I, okay? But the decision is then taken for what seemed to me to be narrow and particularistic and morally indefensible reasons to focus the entire campaign around a particular gender group, which in both cases happens not to be the gender group most targeted for the acts in question. And really to present things in such a way in terms of presentation of evidence, anecdotes, talking heads and authorities, such that you would honestly it would never occur to you that any men were killed at all if that's what you were reading, or that there was ever a problem of murdered and missing Aboriginal men and boys too. You really, first of all, I think, have to somehow separate yourself and be able to stand back from this discourse that's being presented to you and try to see it kind of holus bolus and look for the gaps. And then look for who's creating those gaps, because they're very rarely there by accident. They're almost always serving an agenda. And in this case, it is an agenda, no doubt by people who consider themselves well-intentioned and who are engaged in an important part of the campaign and inquiry, which is to draw attention to the very real and epidemic violence against Aboriginal women and girls in Aboriginal communities and the wider Canadian community nationally, and various other forms of victimization, from domestic violence through suicide, in which Aboriginal women and girls are vastly disproportionately represented compared to women and girls from the dominant society. So perhaps when you have part of the right agenda, it's easier to convince yourself that you're fundamentally well-intentioned and you're doing a good thing and you don't have any further obligation to include or incorporate additional and potentially problematic issues. Because what I'm leaving unmentioned here is that obviously the vast majority of advocates around this issue so far have come from within feminist ranks, broadly construed. I would say most would self-identify as feminists. And there you get, obviously, the explanation for the selectivity. It is a distraction from the basic feminist project. I can't remember which feminist it was, an IR scholar, who said, feminists are partisans of women. V. Spike Peterson, I think. The feminists are partisans of women. It's a nice phrase. Kind of a nice idea. I mean, women need partisans the way men need advocates, right? But partisanship, problematic, particularly when mixed with scholarship and intellectual inquiry and empirical study. If you are letting your preferences and your biases rule the kind of information that you look for and the data that you gather and how you present it, then I think you're entering into the realm of intellectual dishonesty, and there's real ethical questions to be asked. Because what is the broader challenge? What is the project of which this is part? Is it not fundamentally a humanist project? Are we not fundamentally concerned about protecting vulnerable people against violence? And to the extent that we want to use gender or class or race and ethnicity, or the currently trendy approach, intersectionality, right? And there's a lot to be said for that, recognizing that these variables often operate together in complex ways to produce social outcomes. But surely the project is fundamentally one aimed at simply helping and protecting vulnerable and mortal human beings. And then I really must ask, and the people who I'm most mystified by here, as I've suggested, are the Aboriginal women, and most of them, I suspect, self-identified feminists. Because the missing part of your discourse is not just abstract pushing Aboriginal men to the margins. When has Canadian society not done that, right? You'd expect it from just about every other venue, perhaps, and every other source. But would you expect it really from the women of these Indigenous communities when the men that we're talking about are not just abstract Indians or whatever, but are their sons and brothers and husbands and lovers and fathers? I don't understand that. I don't understand why your determination to pursue a narrowly ideological approach to the issue would overrule your basic community empathy for what you must see is going on all around you, probably within your own household to some degree as well, in terms of anomic behavior, vulnerability to violence, suicidal impulses, substance abuse, and the whole bit. And I think that's probably the basic question that advocates ask, and why campaigns are launched. Why? Why should this be? In other words, how can you justify this ethically? And if you can't justify it ethically or even logically, then what do we do about it? What is to be done, the good old Leninist question, and that's the activist portion of this. But you cannot get to the program, you cannot get to supplementing and maybe redirecting to some extent the campaign until you have perceived the way the discourse is working and the way that it is shaping to put some issues on the agenda and some off. I'm going to give you one global example of this because it's, to me, the most obvious and irritating one. And the most widespread one, and we're seeing it all around us right now in an interesting context, which I'll mention. I've already mentioned women and children, all one word, okay? Where does that phrase come from? Women and children. Well, that's been around for a lot longer than feminism. It's associated more with a kind of paternalistic, patriarchal, oh, you poor defenseless women and children, right? So that's one point that I've never quite understood why self-identified feminists are so willing to jump to that phraseology. Because whenever I hear the phrase women and children, what I hear is women are children. And it infantilizes women by lumping them into a category with children. It naturalizes the relationship between women and children in a way that makes it seem as though the natural function and purpose of women is to bear children. That is not the traditional feminist perspective on things, is it? So why is that language and that concatenation being used? I'll tell you why it's being used. First of all, because it activates all of those old patriarchal traditional sympathies. It makes you say, oh, poor women and children. Okay, now you're interested, you're engaged, you're empathetic, and they've got your attention. Secondly, it allows you to manipulate the discourse such that gender, for example, becomes women and children. And thirdly, and crucially, it allows you to stack the decks of the data. And I'll give you one example which is done all the time. I see it all the time. How many of you have heard the statistic, roughly 75%, 3/4 of the refugees in the world are women and children? Sometimes I've heard 80%, okay? Think about that for a second. Where do refugees come from? What are the type of societies traditionally that generate refugees? Overwhelmingly in the global south, yes? What are the demographic patterns in most global south countries? It's very typical to have 50, even 60% of the population under the age of 18. These are very high birth rate societies. Under the age of 18 means children under international law. So there you've got 50% children in a quite typical refugee-generating society, okay? And let's assume for a second that you have an equal division of girls and women, men and boys, 25, 25, 25, 25, with that 50%, okay? So in that scenario, that society producing refugees in demographic proportion and gender proportion, what proportion will be women and girls? Maybe I didn't set it out the right way. 50% children, 25% girls, 25% boys. 50% adults, 25% women, 25% men. Women and children equals 75% because you're putting the girls and boys together with the adult women, okay? What percentage is men and children? How often have you ever heard the phrase men and children? So there's a really interesting example of the way the discourse is being framed, right? The women and children, my God, 75% are women and children. That's a gendered category. Another sneaky thing it does is it genders boys female. Do you see how that's happening? When you collapse girls and boys onto women to produce that kind of broad gendered data, you're subtly feminizing boys to draw them into feminist-oriented data project. And you can't get the 75% unless you do that. Now you go to the United Nations Office of Refugees, and what do you find? They've broken down the data. What percentage of refugees around the world are male versus female? Okay, girls and boys, adult men and adult women. And what we have seen for 20 years is that it has varied between 50.1% female, 49.9% male, and it sometimes flips so that it's 0.2% more male than female. Okay? Refugees are a gendered issue, but they are gendered inclusively. And what are we doing if we say fundamentally that the only refugees we care about, at least from a gender perspective, are women and children? And what does it mean when you're running a refugee camp and developing gender-sensitive projects and you've got a lot of disaffected young men sitting around who've lost their traditional role in life? You know, the role of the provider is now the UNHCR. Only recently did the UNHCR start to say, we've got a problem there. Our gender framework is not really paying attention, and it is creating a disaffected underclass of men who are increasingly exhibiting anomic behavior, including violence against women. One of the reasons I think feminists should pay more attention to men and boys, even if you're only concerned about women and girls or primarily, is that obviously they are the major agents of violence against women, and you need to understand where those patterns are coming from. So how does this pan out in the case of Aboriginal women and girls? We've heard a lot about murdered Aboriginal women. Both Aboriginal men and Aboriginal women are vastly more likely than people of the dominant society in this country to be killed and to be violently victimized for a whole range of other domestic sexual crimes and so on. So there is clearly a serious and disproportionate problem of the violent victimization by murder of Aboriginals, women and men alike. But 2/3 of the murder victims are male Aboriginals. Another thing that we heard a lot about, I think this issue is also very subtly, we're always seeing in the back of our minds Robert Picton, aren't we? We're always seeing missing, murdered, Indigenous, prostituted women. The most savage sorts of murder that, that clearly bring to light the measure of disinterest and incompetence among the authorities in investigating these issues and so on. But that's always at the back of our minds, missing, prostituted Aboriginal women who have not been seen and then turn up years later in mass graves. That, as we know, as soon as you start doing the digging into readily available statistics, is not the pattern of violence against Aboriginal women. And one of the ways, primarily, and one of the ways you can tell that is because 90% of the murders of Aboriginal women in Canadian society are solved. And that is the same rate, incidentally, as it's 1% higher, actually, or 1% lower than homicides of non-Aboriginal women in Canadian society. So there is no specifically Aboriginally gendered issue with regard to unsolved murders of Aboriginal women. They are solved at the same rate as murders of non-Aboriginal women. Murders of homicide in general in Canada are solved at a substantially higher rate for women than for men. For men, it's about 83%. Maybe that's not so significant, but it's notable. So what's the rate for solving of Aboriginal male homicide? Any guesses?
40%.
Any other guesses?
We don't know.
We don't know. The RCMP has released statistics on the number of Aboriginal women's murders that have been solved because they've really been on the hot seat about that, and they want to show that, in fact, and I agree with them, this is not a particular crisis in the Aboriginal community that it's being presented to be. If you ask them what are the parallel statistics for men, they will say, we're not releasing that data. And I can give you the news references. They recently announced also, no, we're holding on to the other side of the gender data. They're quite explicit about it. Missing Aboriginal women in large numbers. And I hate to say this, and I don't say this dismissively, but predictably in some ways, for poverty-stricken and marginalized populations, you would expect to see higher rates of missing than in the dominant population, and with communities without the resources for investigation of cases of missing and so on. We have now raw numbers for the number of missing Aboriginal women. How does it compare to the number of missing Aboriginal men and boys? We don't know, because the RCMP refuses to release that data. I can predict, I think reasonably, based on my global studies, one of the things that you see is, for example, a strong correlation between missing people and homelessness around the world. Another thing you see around the world is an overwhelming correlation between homelessness and male gender. We see in Canada an overwhelming correlation between homelessness and Aboriginal status. Is it then predictable that the large number of missing Aboriginals in this country are in fact men? I think it's predictable. I can't tell you what the relative numbers would be. I suspect it may well be between 2/3 and 80%, maybe as high as 90%, but we don't know. Okay? So that's a big part of the problem, and I think that's a big part of the activist agenda in the future, is simply to force the relevant agencies to release the data, to digest the data, to draw the relevant conclusions, and to pursue and to craft an agenda around the empirics that does justice to the demonstrable vulnerabilities. It's not that one needs to be equal for the sake of being equal. If you can show me that there are specific vulnerabilities of Aboriginal women, and there are in the area of domestic violence, for example, then by all means let's have specific attention to Aboriginal women's specific gendered vulnerabilities in that specific area. But incidentally, and this is the Picton thing again, one of the reasons that 90% of Aboriginal women's murders are solved in this country is because it's frankly well known who the killer is from the start. And that's because the overwhelming majority of these murders occur in domestic and community contexts, just as the overwhelming majority of murders of Canadian women in general occur at the hands of people generally who are known to them, not at the hands of strangers, not at the hands of Robert Picton. Okay? And that's a problem for the campaign, because the government of Canada, I don't agree with them on much, but they have pointed this out, that most of the victimization, the large majority, is being done by Aboriginals overwhelmingly, I don't know how overwhelmingly, Aboriginal men, surely. And if that's the case, what is the crux of the problem? Are we constructing a campaign which is aimed at the Robert Pictons of this world and the RCMPs of this world? Or are we constructing an agenda that is aimed at the crisis of violence and destructiveness and self-destructiveness within Aboriginal societies, reflecting the centuries of oppression, humiliation, marginalization, genocide against this population in our country? It is no surprise that when a population is exposed to that measure of stress and destruction for that period of that number of generations, that you will see these disproportionate and anomic patterns of violence. But if we are just going to focus in on the ones that suit our limited agenda, and I'm not here to say I want to switch the agenda to men and boys at all. Here's what I want to do, and I'll conclude with this and with a quick observation around it. I told you that I still call myself a feminist, and that's in large part a reflection of the kind of solidarity that I feel with a lot of basic feminist causes, mostly in the global south. I personally don't see that much to choose between the gendered discrimination against women in Canadian society and gendered discrimination against men. Maybe we want to get into that after the talk, but I see much more severe discrimination around the world. And when you're talking about things like female infanticide, maternal mortality, problems that are not front and center in privileged societies, I think there's an enormous importance for feminist mobilization around those issues, and a very clear discrimination against women and girls in that context. But lately, and by lately I mean just the last few weeks, because it came out of an argument that I had with a feminist friend, I've found myself leaning towards, and it gets back to that African woman in Geneva that I began this talk with, the concept of a gender advocate. It might sound a bit sort of mushy at the outset, but for me, a gender advocate would be somebody who, first of all, has, I think, absorbed and recognized the essential feminist contribution, which is that gender matters. We would not have a variable of gender if we had not had a school of feminism to academically and from an activist perspective to bring that front and center. So a lot of what I'm doing today is quite derivative in many ways, not only of the empirical and intellectual project of feminism, but the moral and ethical project of feminism as well. But the gender advocate in me says, or is critical and skeptical towards, those aspects of feminism or any other ideology which serve to narrow prima facie our approach to very broad and complex issues, and to focus our attention not necessarily where it is empirically or ethically most justified, and certainly not where it is uniquely justified, okay? And with that in place, recognizes the need for advocacy and the particular relevance of gender to understanding the lived experiences and vulnerabilities to violence of women and men, boys and girls alike. That is what I would think would distinguish a gender advocacy project from a strictly feminist one. And how it would look, as I argued in my article in the National Post a couple of months ago on the subject, how would this look then in terms of an inquiry, reformulating an inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women into something that really gets to grips not only with patterns of violence, but patterns of gendered violence within Aboriginal communities. And I'll just read. What could be titled the First Nations Anti-Violence Initiative would assess topics such as the following. 1, the structural violence of their, Aboriginals, continuing poverty, discrimination, and dispossession from ancestral territories, as well as the reverberating trauma of the residential school genocide. Number 2, Indigenous communities' homicide and suicide epidemics. The white European racism, hubris, and obliviousness that continues to fuel the Aboriginal social crisis and to prompt violence by whites/Europeans against Aboriginal women and men. The specific and urgent issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, centered on the domestic violence crisis afflicting Aboriginal communities, including child abuse, elder abuse, and partner abuse against males, and with attention to issues of alcohol and drug addiction. Because this is another, just as an aside, the framing of the subject of domestic violence is also very interesting, discursively. Not only does it tend to be constructed as male violence against women, but it tends to be focused upon partner violence. And in fact, domestic violence includes things like child abuse and elder abuse and abuse of the handicapped and disabled in the household. And women as agents of that violence are much more prominent than they are in the case of domestic murder, for example. So domestic violence here in all of its manifestations, not just partner violence and certainly not just partner violence against women. The specific issue of missing, murdered, homeless, and addicted Aboriginal men and boys, and their disproportionate representation among incarcerated juveniles and adults, with brackets, with due consideration for Native females whose incarceration and institutionalization rates are also sky high. Next point, the disruption and severing of family and community bonds through social services interventions to sequester Indigenous children, recognizing the need to protect Aboriginal children from family and community violence, preferably through solutions designed and overseen by First Nations populations themselves. The psychological and counseling needs of all Aboriginal survivors of violence and their family members, the psychological and social afflictions of Aboriginal perpetrators of violence and their family members. Perpetrators of violence and how to assuage them. And lastly, the wide variety of Indigenous-generated proposals for change, restructuring, amelioration, and restitution, including those directed at Indigenous women, men, children, and elders. Okay, and one of the themes that runs through this is that this would be a damp squib of a campaign if it were simply another of the inquiries imposed upon Aboriginals by whites. This would need to be something that would be built bottom up in consultation with Aboriginal communities, and I cannot think that those communities don't want us, me as a member of the dominant society, to be engaging with those broader issues. Surely that is a more appropriate use of government funds, a more encompassing and potentially productive agenda than a particularist and ideologically fueled one that leaves even more off the table than it puts on. So I'll stop there. Thanks. I probably ran a bit over time.